Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Purdue Statistics Distinguished Theme Seminar Series on Deep Learning Methods and Theory. It is an honor to have Dr. Ying Nian Wu join us for today's lecture. Ying earned his PhD in statistics from Harvard University in 1996. After that, he joined the Department of Statistics at the University of Michigan as an assistant professor. And currently, Ying is a professor in the Department of Statistics at UCLA. Ying's research areas include generative modeling, representation learning, unsupervised learning, as well as computer vision, computational neuroscience, and bioinformatics. Today, Ying will be talking about representation learning and grid cells. To all of our viewers, you may be watching on Zoom or on YouTube. In either case, you can submit your questions in the chat on either platform. We will be monitoring the chats and we'll pass along the questions to the speaker. Due to limited time, it's possible that we may be only able to answer a subset of the questions, and we apologize if your question is omitted. At this point, I'll hand it over to Ying. It's all yours.
Okay, Jordan. Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and also thanks to Purdue State Department for the invitation, and thank you all for attending my talk. So today I'm going to talk about representation learning and grid cells. So we try to understand grid cells from the perspective of representation learning, which is a very important perspective for deep learning. Before I start, I want to acknowledge that some of the pictures and videos were taken from the internet. So the credit and copyrights and also my gratitude go to those original authors. So as the plan for today's seminar, I will spend most of the time on the representation model for grid cells. But then if I have time, I probably will also talk about the general background context in terms of generative modeling and representation learning. So I will check the chat just in case you may have any questions. Okay, so our work was inspired by two papers, one from DeepMind and the other from Columbia in 2018. So they use deep learning models, for example, recurrent neural network, and also LSTM, long short-term memory, to model this path integral for grid cells. So our goal is to find a minimally simple model, which is more explicit with explicit algebraic and geometric structures. Okay, so the discoveries of the grid cells and also place cells were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 2014. So the grid cells were discovered by May-Britt Moser and Edward Moser. And the place cells was discovered by their teacher, John O'Keefe, and the three, they shared the Nobel Prize. So the grid cells and also the place cells, they were involved in the navigation of the mammals. So the grid cells were discovered in entorhinal cortex, and the place cells were discovered in this hippocampus. And also there are these so-called high direction cells. So when you change the direction, the cell will fire. So the difference between place cells and the grid cells, not only in terms of where they are located in the brain, but also in the response property. So for a place cell, so each place cell will fire at a particular position in the environment. But for the grid cells, each grid cell will fire at multiple locations, multiple positions in the environment. And the positions, those positions where the each grid cell fire actually form a hexagon pattern, very regular hexagon pattern. So that's why they are called grid cells. Yeah, so those grid cells and also place cells, they were studied by this single neuron recording. And nowadays they can simultaneously record multiple neurons. So you insert a electrical needle in the brain for the right, and then you measure the response. If the cell fires, then you hear the beeping type of sound. Okay, and then you place this rat in a say 2 meter by 2 meter environment, and let the rat move around, and then you can measure the response. The response is actually a continuous value, but most of the time it can be 0. So it fire at the selected locations. So let me show you a video. So you can see that the rat is moving around, and the white dots indicate the firing of a neuron, and you hear a beeping. So the firing is actually measured in continuous intensity. And in the beginning, you don't see much of a pattern, but gradually you will see that the neuron or the gray cell fires at multiple locations. And then gradually you see that a hexagon pattern will emerge. So they fire at a hexagon grid. Yeah. So this is what you see. Okay, so now let me show you this picture. So here, those lines, those black curves, those are the trajectories for the right. And for the gray cells, you see that they fire at multiple places, and then they form a hexagon pattern of this equilateral triangle. So you see every 3 nearby locations from this equilateral triangle. And then together they form this hexagon pattern. It's a very regular pattern. So this is this single neuron recording under the self motion. But at the same time, you can also record the place cells, and you can see that each place cell will fire at a certain location. Of course, different place cells will fire at different locations. Okay, so then those gray cells, they were discovered in 2005 by Moses. And let me show you a video clip about their discovery.
People had been there before. Everybody said, no, there's no space signal in this area.
When we made lesions in the hippocampus, which is a structure that was known to contain place signals, surprisingly, those lesions really didn't remove much of the place signal. And that, over a few years, led us to go out of the hippocampus into a structure called entorhinal cortex, which at that time was completely unknown territory. And then we put electrodes in there and recorded activity.
We listen to the cells, and when a rat is going into these fields where in the environment where the cell is very active, then you hear this really high popcorn sound. And look at their beautiful place cell. And it's so rewarding if you have been searching for cells for such a long time and you hear this popcorn sound. It's just fantastic. Are you listening to your brain cells?
Those signals actually formed a very regular pattern, and that was the beginning of the grid cells.
What was so fascinating with this is the mathematics. You could fit equilateral triangles between 3 and 3 spots, so you got perfect hexagons.
And then later we found that that could be a part of the way the brain forms a map.
The grid map is an empty map. So it's like longitudes and latitudes without a map. So you have a coordinate system.
Maybe you can say that the similarity to a GPS is that the system uses the rat's position and movement speed, but doesn't care about what it looks like around. It just uses the change in position, just like a GPS.
And then you have the communication with the hippocampus, where you have the memory. And the memory for the landmarks, for the environment, for everything that is put on top of this coordinate system.
So of course the difference in the human brain is that it's so much more. This area that contains the grid cells happens to be the same area that is first damaged in many, many Alzheimer's patients. One of the first earliest symptoms in Alzheimer's disease is that the patient starts to lose their sense of orientation. They can't find their way. This is one of the first mental functions that we're beginning to understand. And if you learn how this works, perhaps we also learn how the rest of the brain works, because the brain is generally using the same tricks over and over again for different types of behaviors.
Okay, yeah, this...
People had been there before. Everybody said, no, there's no...
Okay, yeah, this is also the motivation for our work. We try to understand the underlying mathematical model, and hopefully this model may also be generalized to other areas of the brain. Again, just to recap, so we have place cells in the hippocampus. It's like a CPU of the brain, where it fires at a particular location. But we also have grid cells that fire at multiple locations that form a very regular hexagon grid pattern. And so this type of cells, they exist across all the mammalian species, including human. So we have these two areas in the brain which correspond to, you can map this to the brain of the rat. And again, this is an illustration for grid cells, and this is place cells. Okay, so if someone has Alzheimer's disease, then usually the grid cells start to deteriorate, and then the person cannot navigate in the environment. And there are actually multiple place cells, and together they form a map of the environment. So each place cell will fire at a certain location. So here, this is not a very regular environment. Nonetheless, you still have the place cell that form a map for the whole environment. And we also have multiple grid cells, and they have different firing patterns. So different grid cells have different scales and phases. So each map corresponds to the firing pattern for a particular grid cell. And the grid cells also form the so-called modules, and the modules as like a group, and together within the same group, they have similar scales and phases. So the multiple grid cells is said to form a internal GPS system that enable us to know where we are. And more specifically, the grid cells and also place cells, they are involved in the navigation. For example, a rat, this may be the home, right, of a rat, and the rat leaves home and then start to explore the environment to forage, find some food. And it may go to different locations at different legs of the journey. And after it finds some food, it may then plan a direct path back to its home. And next time, the rat may directly go from home to where there may be some food. Okay, so in this process, it involves two tasks. One is a path integral. So the rat, or in general, the mammals, in the early days of the mammals, the Earth was ruled by dinosaurs, right? So they often came out at night, nocturne type of behavior. And there's not much of like sunlight, and but they still need to get a sense of cell position based on their sense of cell motion. By accumulating their sub-motion, they should calculate where they are, even if they walk in the darkness. So you can imagine that you walk in your living room in the darkness, try to find the light switch, right? So that's, and then you are aware of where you are based on how you move. So that's the task of a path integral. And also a related task is path planning. So if you want to go from, say, home to a place where there may be food, you can plan a path. When there's no obstacles, you can plan a direct path. Otherwise, you can plan a path that go around it. So this is a path planning. But the path integral is more basic. It is actually also the basis for path planning. And grid cells involvement in the path integral there seem to be some evidence for that. And sophisticated experiments show that so if you impair the grid cells, so then the path integral can be affected. So if you, for example, disrupt the grid cell firing using some biological means, and then apparently the rat cannot do path integral. For example, this is a corridor. So you let the rat swim to find the food, for example. And you first have the corridor so that the rat can only swim in this direction or in this corridor. So, and then normally, if you remove the corridor, then the rat knows the position, even though there's now like a visual cues. And the next time it can go from the home directly to this position where there may be reward. But if you disrupt the grid cell system, then the rat cannot find or cannot calculate where it is. So next time it doesn't know where it should go. So it go to very random directions. And also there seem to be evidence that if the speed encoding system is impaired, then the grid cell periodicity is also being affected. So that means when you receive the sense of some motion, if this pathway is blocked, then you cannot perform the path integral. And also some experiments on, I think it's fMRI experiments on humans suggest that if you ask human to imagine the navigation, apparently the grid cells are being activated. So that means grid cells are also involved in path planning. Okay, so what we want is to find a simple and explicit model for a representational model. For example, a very simple recurrent neural network for path integral. And hopefully this model can explain, or at least can learn, the hexagon grid patterns, and also can maybe reproduce some neuroscience observations. And in particular, the model should be able to perform path integral calculation, and if possible, can also be robust to noises in the neurons, which are very noisy, as we know. And the hope is that by studying this system, we may learn something about the spatial encoding in the brain in general, or even more generally, we learn something about the so-called latent space modeling in the deep learning models. Okay, so now let me present our work. The work was done with Riqi Gao, who's the first author and who's very brilliant and productive. She will be on the job market this year. Okay, so the idea for the grid cells from a mathematical perspective is that they form a vector representation or a latent vector that consists of those latent variables. So we use the notation V for X to represent this vector representation. So X is a 2D position. So we may encode it as a 2D coordinate. And here V consists of D cells. D stands for dimension. So D can be very big. In our work, we use a smaller number. For example, D equals 100. And we use I to denote each cell. So each I denotes a grid cell. And so therefore this V is formed by those vectors, and each V sub Ix is a map. So if you change X, you change the response. So each Vix as a function of X form a 2D map. And so together we have, say, if D equals 100, we have 100 maps. Okay, so that's the representation. And here we let X to be within a environment like a 2 meter by 2 meter, and we discretize it into say 80 by 80 lattice. So the idea is that we want to encode each position by a population or a group of neurons. So together, these D neurons or D grid cells, they form a vector representation of this 2D, two-dimensional X. Okay, so we use this D-dimensional V of X to represent the two-dimensional X. So from the deep learning perspective or representation learning perspective, this is actually a very familiar thing. It's usually it's called embedding. When you want to represent something in a Euclidean space, D-dimensional Euclidean space, it's like you embed this entity in the D-dimensional space. But here we actually embed this 2D lattice in a D-dimensional space. So therefore, this 2D lattice form a two-dimensional manifold in this D-dimensional space. And you may actually contrast it to this T-SNE, which people often use, this T stochastic neighborhood embedding, people usually use for visualization. If you have, say, 100-dimensional observations, right, data, you can embed this 100-dimensional vector into 2-dimensional screen so that you can visualize it. But here we are doing exactly the opposite. So we actually embed 2D like a position in this D-dimensional space. And you may heard of this word to vect, where you embed each word into a three-dimensional vector, so that each word become a continuous dense vector. And here, what we are trying to do is position to vec. So that is, we encode each 2D position in as a vector, or sometimes we may also call this as a position embedding. In fact, in some deep learning models like transformer, they have the position embedding for the position of the word. And then after you do this encoding, you encode each X into a vector V, and then you want to be able to decode it, right? So from V back to X. So this is part of decoding that we are going to talk about later on. Okay, let me see if I have any questions. Jordan, are there any questions from the audience?
I don't see any questions yet.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you. So let me then continue. So here I just give you the basic idea for this notation and representation. So the goal is we treat the grid cells together as forming a vector representation for 2D position. And then we discuss about the grid cells, their involvement in a path integral, then how we use this vector representation to perform path integral. And the path integral is actually very simple. It's just a 2D addition, right? So we use x sub t to denote the position of the right at a moment t. So this x is a two-dimensional coordinate. And then the self-motion can be encoded as a delta x, the change of this 2D position. And here you can also think of this as a 2D vector, 2D displacement, right? And then you just add this x, 2D xt by this 2D delta x, and then you get xt plus 1, the position for the next moment. This is extremely simple addition calculation. But if we represent xt by a vector v, so v of xt, so we are now in the d-dimensional mental space, you can think of this. And then how do we implement this calculation for addition? So our model assumes that this calculation is implemented by a matrix multiplication. So that is, we have a matrix M, which actually depends on this delta x. And you can think of this as a matrix representation for the displacement delta x. Okay, so if V is a d-dimensional, then M is a d by d matrix. And then if we add delta x to xt, then correspondingly, as if we mirror this calculation in the mental space, we multiply this m delta x to this v of x, and we get the v, the vector representation for the next position. Okay, so the key idea for our model is this representation. So this is the representation model that I was talking about. So you use a vector to represent the position, and then you use a matrix to represent the submotion. So therefore, this simple addition calculation is represented in the brain, so to speak, by this matrix and vector multiplication. Or in other words, the 2D submotion is represented by a rotation in the d-dimensional mental space. And here we say M, this matrix M, as a matrix representation of delta x, and often we use orthogonal matrix, and this is related to the mathematical subject called the group representation. So those delta x together for different values of delta x, they form a additive group, right? This the so-called 2D Euclidean group, very simple addition. So the group action is simply just a addition, and the group representation means that you want to use a set of matrices to represent those group actions, and often people want to use the so-called unitary representation, so that each matrix for M of delta x is a orthogonal matrix or unitary matrix in general. So this is a very important part of modern mathematics and physics. And in fact, a large part of quantum physics is based on this matrix representation. And this is where we drew our inspiration. And later, I will tell you how we parametrize this M matrix. So we actually discover this matrix Lie group and the Lie algebra structure based on some simple mathematical calculation. But given this representation model, where you can think of this V as a noun and this M as a verb, so you change the displacement, change your cell position, right? And then this matrix rotate this vector. And you can use this representational model for path integral. So suppose V sub t is the vector representation of your current position, and then you sense your submotion as a delta x sub t, and then you have this matrix representation, and this matrix multiply this vector, or this matrix rotate this vector to get the vector for the next moment. And this enable you to perform path integral. Of course, you should also be able to decode V back to X, the cell position, and I will discuss this a little bit later. But first, we also, as I mentioned, the grid cells, they form modules or multiple blocks. So notation-wise, we can write V of X as consisting of V sub k of X. So each V sub k is a subvector. And then for different blocks or different modules, we assume that they're rotated by different matrix representations. So correspondingly, we also have k blocks. So that therefore, M, the whole matrix, is actually block diagonal matrix. So each subvector is rotated by its own submatrix. And based on the neuroscience observations, so those different modules of the grid cells, so they like different blocks, and within the same module, the grid cells, they share the similar scales, but different phases in their response map. Phases means spatial shift. And so therefore, you may imagine that the whole grid cell system as forming a multi-arm clock. So each block as a subvector is like one arm of the clock rotated by this corresponding M matrix in the mental space. And that enables the calculations of the path integral to be done more easily, so that this matrix M may be of a lower dimensional. Okay, so now let me talk about how do we decode the position based on the vector. So the decoding is related to these place cells. And often in the literature, a place cell is modeled by a adjacency kernel. And so we have this, oh, I saw some chat, maybe I can stop and take some questions. Let me read the chat. So the question is there a reason for this is just a typical discretization. So we discretize it into 80 by 80, but you can also discretize it by 100 by 100. It's just a matter of spatial resolution, very much like how you get the resolution for the image. And yeah, so here another question about the matrix M. So here we assume that the matrix M is a rotation matrix, so it can only rotate. It doesn't change the overall like a square length of V. So that may be quite plausible because the sum of squares of those VI, they better to stay within a certain range, being the responses of the neurons. This model is a very simple model, and for this simple system, when you have this very regular pattern, we hope to search for a very simple model. And this model is actually a representation model where we use this V to represent a position and M to represent this submotion. And to justify this model, we can justify this as a minimally simple model. So that is, if you assume a nonlinear model for V, and then if you perform a first order Taylor expansion, then locally you get this linear model. So that's a justification. So from this Taylor expansion, and then you can easily get this linear model if you assume the minimally simple model. So therefore, the justification is really based on mathematical simplicity. Yes, and otherwise you have a the so-called like a RN model, recurrent neural network model, which involve this nonlinear rectifications. And here we try to keep the model as simple as possible. Okay, so now let me go back to the place cells. And oops, yeah. So a place cell is in general modeled by a Gaussian kernel in the open field. So if the rat is moving in the open field, so here so this X prime indicate the position. So each place cell is associated with a position here X prime, and its response when. So for the place cell associated with X prime, when the agent is at X moving around, then the firing is modeled by this Gaussian kernel, which is actually a adjacency kernel. And for other environment, not open field, other more complex environment, it is often modeled as how often, say, the agent will visit X prime if the agent start from X. So you can use say, when the rat explore the environment, the rat can actually estimate this adjacency kernel. Okay, and so here, this is the map for a single place cell, a particular place cell where X prime is fixed, and this is a function for X. Okay, and a popular model for this, the relationship between place cell and the grid cell is that we can actually represent a place cell by the inner product. So here V of X is your vector representation for this position X, right? And then you can actually decode this X by a readout decoding vector. So this is decoding vector, you multiply the inner product, you get the adjacency kernel. So this is a dimension reduction model, a linear model. So here, U of X prime is a readout decoding vector for this place cell associated with position X prime. So in the decoding process, so let V be your vector representation of cell position. And then you can compute a heat map. So for each place or each place cell, then compute this response, this inner product. So, and then together you have a heat map, but this one is a function of x prime with a v fixed. Okay, and then you see that you have the heat map and the maximum. If you do a non-maximum suppression, you get one hot position. So you know where you are because you know that how close x prime is with the position supposedly encoded by this v. Okay, so therefore, after you decode the position, let's call this x hat, which is argmax for this heat map. Again, you can transform this into one hot map when you decode position. You can then do the re-encoding, so that is you replace your current vector v by this v of x hat. So this is actually like a projection of this v onto the 2D manifold of the code book. And so that is if we treat this v of x, so this is embedding of 2D lattice, right? So this is the 2D manifold in this d-dimensional space. So each time you can project your vector v onto this code book, and then you can get your x, the position, and also you can re-encode it. So this way you can get rid of the noise. We know that the neurons tends to be noisy, and this projection can play the role of error correction. And if you look at this model is actually a model for matrix factorization. For example, in the recommender system, right, you have the ratings of customers, and you do this matrix factorization for dimension reduction, because X is 80 by 80. So the dimension of this A is 80 to the fourth power, and you can use the dimension reduction to model this. So this may be useful when a rat explores the environment, so it can quickly learn this adjacency kernel very easily with a small number of explorations. And another point of view for this representation is that for each x prime, each position, so we have function, right? This function is a Gaussian kernel function. And this v sub x is actually a basis function. So you have d, for example, if d is 100, you have 100 basis functions. So basically you want to represent this a of x for each position, each place, by a linear combination or decomposition of the basis functions, where this u for each x prime, this u plays the role of coefficients. For example, here you have two place cells, right? And each place cell can be represented by a linear combination for those grid cell maps. And the connections are represented by this weights in this u, so u as the coefficients. And so therefore this v as a basis function, and we want to know where v come from. So this v come from this matrix representation, or this so-called unitary representation of delta x. And from this matrix representation for any reference position, say x equal to 0, and then you can multiply this by corresponding m delta x, you can get all those v, all the other v. So this is a way we generate a basis function, and so that is v of x is generated by this matrix representation. And this actually is based on a very deep generalization for Fourier analysis. So Fourier analysis is defined for the real, in the real domain, right? But for the Lie groups, and Fourier analysis is performed or derived based on this matrix representation through the so-called Peter-Well theorem. So the idea is that this basis function is generated by this type of representation model. Usually in the past, people assume that those basis functions are orthogonal to each other. But here we are not making this assumption. And in terms of learning, so we simulate the trajectories. And then from the simulated trajectories, we can get this position x and also delta x, which is a one-step displacement. And then we can learn this vector representation of the position, and also read out a vector for each place, and also this matrix representation where dx is local. So the loss function is very simple because we have two parts of the model. One is a reconstruction of this adjacency kernel by the inner product. So here we randomly collect x and x prime on the same trajectory. And the other part is this vector matrix type of representation of a path integral. And the lambda is chosen so that the magnitude of the two loss are similar to each other. And then we can use a gradient descent on this three set of parameters to minimize this loss function. And we use Adam optimizer. And later I will show you the parametrization of this matrix M. But here, let me show you the results. So we have multiple blocks, multiple modules, and then we can learn those like grid cell patterns. So we can actually learn very regular hexagon patterns. So here in this example, we have 6 blocks, and each block has 32 cells. So that is, each row is a block, and each map is the map of a single grid cell. So we compare the learned result with some neuroscience observations, for example, the gridness. And actually, it's obvious that all those cells show a very clear grid pattern. Nonetheless, we still calculate the gridness scores, and they all pass the test for being a grid cell. And also, it is somehow observed that the scales, if you look at the scales, they have different scales, right? And you can actually measure the scales for those response maps. And the scales form clusters. And here we show that the scales of those cells form 3 clusters. And if we look at the center of the clusters, and then for nearby clusters, the ratio is around 1.5 or maybe square root 2. So again, this agrees with the neuroscience observation. And the orientations also form clusters. And also within the same module, same block, the orientations, all those grid cells share the same orientation. This also seems to agree with the neuroscience observations. Let me see if I have questions, chat. Okay. Oh, sorry, the agent is just a rat or a human if you move around, for example, in your environment. And your brain can memorize many environments, and each environment is represented by a set of play cells, and then the position. So here it's not the detector. So here we just model the rat. So the agent is the rat, and we look at the position of the rat. When the rat, we simulate the trajectories of the rat, and then we learn from the simulated trajectory. So we are not doing any like fMRI or neuroscience measurements type of data. So the data are purely from simulated data. So it's like a rat is exploring its environment, and you get this simulation. Another question is the use of A. Right. So here, the A is used to learn these basis functions that are generated by this matrix M, matrix representation. So let me go back to that slide. Okay. Yeah. So here we, from simulated trajectories of the rat, we sample X and also delta X for one step, and we use this loss to learn this V and M. If you only use this loss, you are going to get a degenerate solution. For example, you can take M to be identity, and then all the V are the same, right? But this part is so that we learn A, so that this V form a basis function, so that each of this AX can be expanded into the basis function, and the basis function are generated by this constraint. They follow this constraint. So therefore, from this A, which assumed to be Gaussian in the open field, you can then learn M and V. So that's the flow of the information. So you know this A, and this A enables us to learn V and M. And we get these basis functions from this loss function. Yeah, and actually, if we change the number of blocks and number of cells, we can still learn this grid pattern. So it is very robust. And also, we show that this model is capable of a path integral, very accurate path integral. And through this projection, it actually can also perform, it's extremely accurate, actually. So after, say, 500 steps, the decoding error, the path integral error is still close to 0. So that is, the system is capable of near exact path integral. And if you increase the number of cells in each block, you actually can reduce the error. And also this system, through this projection to the 2D manifold, is also capable of error correction. So for example, if the noise is the same as the magnitude of the response, then with a re-encode projection, then so after 100 steps, the error is still like in the 2 meter by 2 meter environment, the error is like a 7 centimeter. And also, if you have this dropout mask, for example, if you randomly silence half of the neurons, then the error is still like a 9 centimeter. So you can still manage to move around. So with this error correction capability. Okay, so now let me briefly explain how to parametrize this M through this Lie algebra and Lie group type of structure. So actually, in a biological system, we don't encode the delta X by the two coordinates, like a delta X1, delta X2. That's not plausible. Actually, we encode this delta X displacement by delta R. This displacement along direction theta is like a polar system. So implicitly, of course, you can get delta X, but we don't actually use this implicit representation. So we just encode the displacement by the direction of the movement, right? And also how much you move. And remember that in our brain, we have place cells and we have grid cells, and we also have a high direction cell, which actually tell us our theta, which direction we are moving. So there is also a path integral for the high direction, which we are not considering. But here we consider a infinitesimal displacement. So suppose we make a very small displacement, delta R. We use this small delta R and theta to represent this infinitesimal displacement. And then there's one question about where we get this model. So let's assume that this V of X plus delta X, so the vector representation of the next position, is a function of the current vector and the delta R and theta. And if you do a Taylor expansion, and if you assume a minimally simple model, and the model is this form, so it's very much like a residual form of a recurrent linear network. So that is, you have this identity, and then you make a small change. This is like a first derivative of this F. And the first derivative, if you assume it's a linear, then this this matrix, B matrix, only depends on theta and multiplied by delta R in the first order Taylor expansion for this delta R. Okay, so this is a minimally simple model. And we call this B of theta as a generator matrix. And we say that V of X is rotated by this general matrix B of theta. And in order for this to be a rotation, you only need to assume that B is skew symmetric. That is, B is a negative for B transpose. And so that is, you only need to learn this lower triangle of the matrix, and the upper triangle is just the negative of the lower triangle. So it is very easy to enforce orthogonality of this M. Okay, and then we have this model. So based on this infinitesimal model, and with some simple calculation, you get this finite, if delta X is finite, and then you get this type of representation. So that's the exponential map. So that is for finite delta X, not infinitesimal. This M matrix is the exponential of B theta delta R. The underlying matrix, underlying calculation is really just based on this very simple calculation very much like analyze how you calculate your bank account, right? With the interest, like delta is like interest. So here, this is this structure is, or in particular, this structure is a so-called Lie algebra, and this structure is a Lie group. So the Lie group is really just a exponential mapping, exponential of the Lie algebra. And as a Lie group is both a group and also a manifold. And then Lie algebra is, so this part is really just a tangent space of the Lie group at the identity. So therefore, we are embedding this 2D Euclidean space, 2D Euclidean map into the 2D nonlinear manifold on this d-dimensional sphere, because we assume that's a rotation. And then we have this representation of M. So this is how we parameterize this M matrix, which has a generator matrix times delta R. And we approximate this exponential map by second order tail expansion, because delta R is only local. So second order tail expansion is quite accurate. And then actually here, our system consists of two rotation systems. One is the Lie algebra for the submotion. When you move, this Vx is rotated by b theta. So for different directions, you have different b. But then we also introduce a model. So this b of theta is almost like a representation of the head rotation, head direction. And then if you change your direction, so when you move, you may change your head direction. If you change your direction, then this b itself is rotated by another generator matrix C. And then you have another system of Lie algebra and Lie group. So this part is another loss function we added when we learn the grid cell model. So the idea is that when the agent, the red moves, for example, move in this direction, the corresponding vector is rotated by b. And when you change the direction, this b matrix, generating matrix, is rotated by another generator matrix C. So this gave us a mapping for this system, this so-called egocentric polar system type of a movement. And so actually with a little bit mathematical calculations, we can show that this 2D shape, right, this polar system, the movement, we actually embed this into the d-dimensional sphere. And locally, we actually preserve this local shape, local geometry with these two systems. So here, this rotation actually mirrors the rotation in this 2D space. And here, this rotation actually is representing the displacement. So that is the 2D displacement is represented by this rotation. And the change of direction also naturally represented by another rotation. So we preserve this local geometry. However, we show that in this movement, so when you move from Vx to Vx plus delta x, so mentally you rotate it. And we can prove that under this system, the angle of the rotation is omega times the Euclidean distance in the original 2D space. So that is somehow this system is magnified local isometry. So you preserve the distance, but you magnify it. Okay, so that is when you move a little bit, actually your mental vector rotate by a big amount. So for example, this omega can be as big as 100. And so this omega captures the matrix of scale for each block. Each block has its own omega, and then you have the different scales. And why do we need this omega to be very big? So this actually underlies error correction. So when you move a little bit, your vector are far apart. So therefore, even if your vector consists of very noisy elements, you can still know where you are. So you can still do error correction. You are not going to confuse x with x plus delta x by this enlarged, this magnified local isometry. And this also underlies periodicity. So that is, when you move a little bit, your vector already move a lot for each block. So this vector, subvector move a lot. And then you run out of space to move around. And this vector will quickly rotate back to itself. And then you observe this periodic pattern. So this periodic pattern is almost like a necessity for this error correction. You want this omega to be very big. Okay, so this underlies our model. And as I mentioned, this B is rotated by another vector, another matrix C. So this is connected to the head direction system. And we actually plot this matrix B. So this matrix B actually learns this sine and cosine tuning. So that is when you rotate in the 2D. So in your mental space, this B vector also get rotated in order to preserve this geometry. So this is our model assumption, and this is very important for learning this hexagon grid pattern. Okay, so now let me take some questions. Let me see. So how to get we don't get the V of X, we just simulate a sequence of X and delta X. So you generate the sequence of X and delta X in each step, right? You generate this trajectory. And from this trajectory, you are given this A, you are given this adjacency kernel, and then you automatically learn this V of X. So we are not using any neuroscience measurements. We are not fitting any neuroscience measurements. So we actually learn this model that agrees with neuroscience measurements. Okay. Since the network is learning from different grid size heat maps, yeah, again, we are not learning the neuroscience measurements of the heat maps. So we actually learn just from this trajectory, or we just learn from this A adjacency kernel, which assume given, and then everything just emerge automatically. So that is, we want to have a mathematical model where those patterns emerge without fitting any biological observations. Okay. So now let me just briefly mention the background, the context where we did our work in terms of representation learning. Actually, much of our work involved this generator matrix, where you have a generator where on the top you have this 100-dimensional Z vector, also a vector representation, but it's a vector representation for this big image. And then you pass through a neural network, you can generate a matrix. So usually this model is learned by GAN or VEE, where Z is considered as an embedding or encoding or in general representation. So previously, the model is assumed that the Z follow a structureless normal zero identity isotropic Gaussian distribution. And in our recent work, including the grid cells, we try to we try to do latent space modeling. We try to find the structures and the models in latent space. So before doing that, we actually also try to unify variational and adversarial learning by jointly learn a generator model that I showed you before, and also a energy-based model which define a probability density function through a energy function as an anomalized density function. And also the inference model as in the variational autoencoder. So we find a divergent triangle type of loss function that unifies these three models, and then it can generate those images. For example, we can generate high resolution images, and we can also interpolate generated images. So you can see the smooth change. And we also studied a model where we have shape vector and appearance vector, so that they are encoded in a disentangled way, so that we can change the shape without changing the appearance. And we can also exchange the shape vector and the appearance vector. For example, this image is obtained by combining the appearance of this guy and the shape of this woman. And also this image is obtained by combining the shape of this guy and the appearance of this woman. So these are the like a generalization. And we can also do latent space modeling by a recurrent neural network similar to the grid cell, where this in the latent space, the latent vector follow a like a hidden Markov model. And we can also do this multi-layer latent variable, so that you have abstractions at multiple layers. This was done by Eric Nijikamp, who's a very creative student, also on the job market. And also we do latent space energy-based model where we can get a strong performance in image modeling and also text generation, okay, and also anomaly detection. This code is just one page, very simple with a very clean code and a very clean theoretical formulation. So now let me wrap up. So the idea is the general context is to do latent space modeling. So we observe big data from long-term passive perception and small data from short-term exploration and supervision. So in the grid cells and the place cells, we learn both distributed representation and also one-hot representation. So very much like this particle wave duality, where place cell is like a particle and the grid cell as a wave. And somehow this type of duality also appear to exist. We have symbolic symbols, right? And we also have like dense representations, and how to combine them is still quite a mystery. And hopefully this grid cell and place cell type of model gave us some hint. So that's the reason we study this system and try to keep the model as simple as possible. I think I can stop here and maybe take some questions.
Looks like we have a couple of questions in the chat. If anyone else wants to submit a question, you can go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very good question. The question is, can this model generalize to 3D locations? Yes, we can also generalize to 3D. And in fact, for bat who's flying, right, it has to be 3D. So we did some generalization, also learned some grid patterns. But I don't know about, say, fish. I don't know whether they have similar, like a navigation system. Supposedly, they should. Also, shell said that by the latent distribution, can be transformed into any, model the latent distribution. So actually, the reason people use GAN is that the generator model is not very expressive in terms of modeling those complex patterns in images. And then you somehow need to twist this GAN towards some local modes, and there's a mode missing issues. And the underlying reason is really because the prior model, where we assume to be isotropic Gaussian, this model is too simple. And we may learn a energy-based model in the latent space. And in the latent space, it's low dimensional, 100 dimensional. So the model is very simple. But with a very simple model, you can actually greatly improve the expressive power for this original generator model. And I think that can actually model very like a non-Gaussian latent distribution. And also, if you introduce latent one-hot vectors, you can actually learn a latent space classifier. So that is because energy-based model is essentially a generative version of a discriminator or classifier. And you can learn latent space classifier. And also you can do latent space symbolic reasoning. When you couple a dense vector and a symbolic vector. So that is latent space modeling seems to be a very useful direction to explore.
So I think we're just about out of time. So thanks, Ying, for joining us today and for giving a really fascinating and insightful talk. To our viewers, we would appreciate you sharing any feedback you have about this online seminar format. On the distinguished seminar page on the Purdue Statistics website, you'll find a link where you can share your suggestions with us. The final lecture of this seminar series will be next Friday, September 18th. Note that next week's seminar will be at 3:30 p.m. instead of 10:30. We hope you'll all join us then to hear from Dr. Ruslan Salakutinov. We hope to see you then.